Hello, and welcome to the April 2026 AMA episode of the Inner Fire Climbing podcast. I am Jesse Firestone, your host. Just a reminder that these podcast episodes are supported by my Patreon. If you want lots of bonus content, or you want to ask questions for the AMAs, or if you just want to support the show, you can become a patron over at patreon.com/innerfireclimbing. The podcast is also supported by my clients. So if you enjoy the show and you're thinking about working with me, there are a variety of ways that you can do that. You can get 8 or 12 week blocks of coaching through C4HP. That's Camp 4 Human Performance. Those are custom per person plans that include hours of contact time with me. And pretty soon you'll also be able to buy training plans on the Sequence app. And you can also buy my technique course, The Principles of Problem Solving, also currently over at the Camp 4 Human Performance site. If you have any questions about any of that stuff, feel free to send me a DM or an email. All right, on with the show. Okay, first question this month is from Ethan. What is your opinion on strength training 1 to 2 hours after an outdoor session, both fingers and general full body strength? It seems like a good way to increase rest periods throughout the week, but I may have heard Tyler Nelson once discourage the idea of training fingers when slightly tired. So I think full body strength training is probably fine a couple hours after a climbing session. I would eat something, and the longer the rest, the higher output your strength training is going to be. So if you have a legit outdoor session and you go straight to the gym, I would expect that your lifts are all going to be a little bit weaker, but that's not really a huge deal as long as you're lifting with auto regulation. And I've done this quite a bit myself. I used to pretty regularly go to the gym to warm up and then go climb outside and then go back to the gym and do my strength training when I lived in Bend. And a lot of the outdoor climbing there is kind of in the town, so it was easy to do that without making too much of a commute. And it just kind of worked for me to do it in that order. As far as finger training, I would probably try to separate that from the climbing a little bit more unless you're including your finger training in your outdoor session. So I do like doing some pretty high effort recruitment curls at the beginning of a projecting session. So those would be somewhere between 85% effort to 100% effort. Some types of finger training are going to be less likely to be overloaded. So the more eccentric like or the more yielding like your finger training is, the less that I would encourage you to do it at the beginning of or directly after your climbing session. So that would be referring to like max hangs or super heavy pickups. Those types of training are a lot more fatiguing, and they're also a lot easier to do when you're fatigued because of the eccentric nature of the contraction. So you don't need to worry about all the details of the physiology there. I think that the key takeaway is that if you're going to do finger training at the beginning of your climbing session or right after your climbing session, I would make it some kind of finger training that's auto-regulated. So I wouldn't be lifting weight or putting weight on a harness. I would do something where the load is, you're creating the load from your own body, something that's more of an overcoming style contraction. And in general, I think Tyler's recommendation is to do your finger training, 4 to 6 hours separate from your session. So if you went outside in the morning or in the afternoon, then you could do your finger training in the evening, like after you come home and, have dinner, put the kid to bed, and then maybe do your finger training, or do your finger training in the morning and then go climbing in the evening. But, with all of those strategies, the thing to bear in mind, and probably the biggest takeaway with the timing of finger training, is that the total volume in the week matters the absolute most. So if you're just doing too much stuff or you're just doing very little stuff, it sort of doesn't matter as much anymore what order you put things in. So if the outdoor session you're having is, you're going out and climbing 4 sport routes and you're out for 4 or 5 hours, it's probably not a huge deal where you put it. But if your outdoor session is you're going out for 8 hours and you're trying a variety of different double-digit boulders, then you don't need to add any finger training on top of that unless you have a very high capacity. And likewise, if your outdoor session is going out and climbing 2 trad routes that are 5'8" or something, it's like, does it really matter if you train your fingers right after that? Probably not. It's probably fine in most cases. So pay attention to the total volume. Try not to have crazy spikes of load week to week. And if you're doing that, then a lot of different structures in terms of timing are going to work. Okay, Josh asks, hi, I have relatively short legs and not a very good high step. I am also very stiff in my hips. I'm good at positioning my core and hips in needed positions, but if my pelvis is stationary, I struggle with leg mobility. I also have severe anterior pelvic tilt. Any tips? Many thanks. I think I would need quite a bit more context regarding your strength and flexibility and your training history. Ironically, I think I would say if you're good at positioning your core and your hips in needed positions, then you might have better mobility than you think. Because I sort of think of the definition of having good mobility or good flexibility. I prefer the term flexibility. I would think of that as being your access to positions on the wall. So if you feel like you're getting yourself in good positions, then probably you have decent flexibility. If you feel like there are a lot of positions that are not available to you, then that would be a sign that you struggle with your flexibility. And then kind of corollary to that would be a lot of people probably don't know that their flexibility could be better because they just don't know the positions that they don't have access to. And then when they start to work on their flexibility, they realize what a deep well it is for them to keep coming back to improve their performance. That aside, not really having any context, my recommendations in rough priority order would be number one, strength training of the lower body. So if you're not doing regular strength training, then that's going to be the highest bang for your buck thing, because it's likely that your sensation of not being very mobile could also be just not being very coordinated or not being very strong. And adding some strength to the lower body would probably help you feel not so stiff. So, if you feel like hip flexion, so lifting your foot to do a high step is something you struggle with, then, front step ups, side step ups, some kind of lunge variation, Bulgarian split squats, lying hip extensions, all those things would be really good choices. Second recommendation would be end range training for hip flexion and external rotation. So for hip flexion, that could be like a terminal high step lift where you have like a band around your quad and the other side of it is wrapped around a rack or wrapped around your other foot, and you're lifting to the extreme end range and resisting. The band is resisting you. Or you can put a kettlebell on your toe and do the same thing. There's other ways to train hip flexion, like a long lunge with some load would be another good way, like a runner's lunge. External rotation, I really like a horse stance squat or a frog pose, like 90-90 pose, things like that. Those are all things where you can get into that end range and both practice it and also develop a little bit of tolerance to the positions and sort of teach your body that it's okay to go into those positions. Third thing would be regular practice on the wall. So getting on the wall on good holds that you are not stressed to hold onto those positions. It shouldn't be super easy. So if you get on a slab and it's 5'2", then that's going to be too easy and it's not going to be legitimate skill development. But it also shouldn't be like tiny holds that are strenuous for you to hold onto. And just ladder up the wall, high stepping to 80 or 90% of your comfort level for every move. So you're going to high step your right foot and then move your right hand and then walk your feet around and then high step your left foot, move your left hand. You're going to do that all the way up the wall. And auto belay is a really good option for that. And this doesn't have to just be a hip flexion thing. You can use a similar methodology to practice getting to splits positions or getting into drop knee positions or doing heel hooks, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, if you struggle with your flexibility and you're not doing something like that and you are already hitting item number 1 and number 2, then that's probably a missing piece for you, because a lot of people who perceive themselves as not being flexible do not practice getting into the end range on the wall. And then it's no surprise that when you're climbing on your project and that the positions are really, really strenuous for you and you're trying really hard just to stay on the wall, well, of course, you're going to feel like you don't have access to that flexibility because you're just trying so hard to not fall. It needs to be practiced at a lower intensity first. And then priority thing number 4, maybe some other people would put this higher on the list, but I would say regular stretching, just because for a lot of people, just regular stretching doesn't really seem to make a big dent in their flexibility. But I think if it's added to those previous 3 things, it can be quite effective. And it takes some time to learn how to stretch effectively. So those other 3 things feel more important to me. But if you have the time, you can definitely throw stretching, 30 minutes a day or something into the mix. And I think it could be quite efficient. Doesn't have to be 30 minutes a day, by the way. It can be like as little as 5 minutes a day. But I think those other 3 things are probably more important. And just to summarize the suggestions, strength training of the lower body, end range training for hip flexion and hip external rotation, regular practice on the wall, and maybe a regular stretching regimen, if that's not something you have already. And just a PS, I'm not personally worried about anterior pelvic tilt. It's pretty unlikely that that's having any significant impact on any of this stuff. I think that's a little bit of a boogeyman, but I am not a doctor. All right, Jantina asks, I see World Cup climbers doing off-the-wall balance exercises as part of their warm-up or training, and their performance in these balance exercises is very impressive compared to less elite climbers who attempt the same exercises. How well do off-the-wall balance exercises translate to climbing performance where balance is particularly important, such as slab climbing? Yeah, balance is kind of a funny concept or a funny term because in the strength and conditioning literature, it starts to look a lot like the word balance can be just replaced with the word strength. Like, old people tend to fall down and hurt themselves, and then bad things happen in their lives. And there's a lot of scary stuff out there about that being related to their balance. But the deeper you dig into the literature, the more it just starts to seem like what they're really losing is strength. Their muscles are not as strong as they used to be. And part of strength in that sense is coordination. So your ability to fire the right muscles at the right time, which we can also think of as balance. And it turns out if you have a lot of strength available to you, you're going to have a lot of balance available to you as well. So the coordination piece is very secondary. I think the takeaway answer to this question is it's probably very, very low value intervention for like 99.9% of climbers. The big thing is it doesn't use the soft tissues of the fingers, which is the primary rate limiter for getting better at climbing. It's how much practice you can do in a week is basically dependent on the recovery potential from the elbow down. It's very, very rare in climbing that like our lat is going to be sore and that's going to prevent us from having a session. A lot of the time our lat's going to be sore and we're just going to go have a session anyway. But if you're a pro athlete with a very high capacity and you're training 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you probably have some time in there for very low intensity training modes. And I think that's part of why we see a lot of that stuff. It's like, it's just something that they can do where they maybe are making some gains from it, but the cost is very low because these people are not going to a job. They're not sitting in a car commuting. They're not, washing dishes and cooking meals and putting their baby to bed. They're probably doing some of those things, but they're not, their life is not as much of an endless loop of those things as it is for some of us. And in the same vein, I've said this before, but with the training stuff that we see from those athletes, we're going to see the most flashy and least interesting stuff to the extent that climbing athletes are doing things like squats or bench press or, even pull-ups. Like that stuff is relatively uninteresting to the algorithm because it's not flashy and it's not novel. And so we see the least of the most useful stuff probably. And we see the most of the most novel stuff. And related to that, we don't get the counterfactual. So if there are athletes who are not doing bench press, but they're, throwing lacrosse balls back and forth while balancing on one foot with their eyes closed and singing Yankee Doodle Dandy, well, we have no way of knowing if that's actually better than a bench press unless we can have that same athlete bench press and compare A and B. So until we have like good twin studies or at least, better science related to the impact of classic strength training on competitive climbers, then I think it's a little bit fraught to think that everything that we see them do is really valid. All right, Sam asks, is a first ascent / developing a climbing area an act of discovery or a form of ownership? And when access is fragile, what responsibility comes with it? I've seen places like Joe's Valley and Washington State where environmental ethics seem to get pushed aside in favor of achievement over care, such as rope grooves forming from repeated headpoint attempts on soft sandstone or classic boulders accumulating chalk and skin oils without stewardship, such as the 5-star boulder. I don't believe anyone is entitled to the rock beyond treating it with respect, so I personally believe newer areas should be protected more deliberately, the same way we respect people. Thanks, Jesse. You're the man. No, Sam, you're the man. I don't know that development is an act of discovery or a form of ownership necessarily. I think I kind of push back on the idea that people can own a boulder or a crag, and I think the more people try to cling to that sense of ownership, the more toxic it is for the local community. My best experiences with development have come from a collaborative sort of experience and just sharing and everybody just being on the same page that we're trying to be out there having a really positive experience. And that's maybe where the active discovery piece comes in. I do feel like that part is part of it, but it's much more fun when it's something engaged in socially and not something that you just keep to yourself. So I don't know that it fits into any of those neat buckets. As far as the access and the responsibility, that's probably more of an issue when it comes to the sharing part of development, which, you and I both know, not every developer shares all their stuff, and not all the people sharing stuff are developers. There is a incredibly pervasive philosophy in modern times that information is free, and if you can just get the information, then you can share it with whoever you want. And that is an interesting thing that the climbing community has to contend with. I actually just read a couple posts by the prominent guidebook author from the Font area because he's put out all these books and he runs below.info. And there are apps that you can get when you're in Font that have just harvested all the info straight off of the below.info website. And they're free apps, and they just took all that info, made an app, and you can just use it. And it's very convenient from a climbing perspective, but it sucked all this money away from the guy who spent so much of his life writing those guidebooks and creating this website and sharing all that information. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't know that there's an easy answer, but there are definitely wrong answers. And I agree with you that areas should be protected more deliberately. I don't think that that's a unique thing for newer areas. I would actually say the areas that have the highest impact are probably going to be the ones that have the longest history. So forest land in the center of Leavenworth, obviously bears the brunt of a lot of Leavenworth tourism. And so they put in these big tank trap fences to try to keep people within about 20 feet of the boulders and just try to keep the local wildlife and flora and fauna from getting totally bulldozed. And I think that's been pretty effective. But as somebody who's climbed here for the better part of 20 years, it's definitely interesting to basically there's almost no vegetation between those tank traps and the boulders. And I'm heartened to see that there is vegetation on the other side of the fence. But yeah, everywhere that people are allowed to be has just been basically turned into a sandbox. And I'm sure it's that way at climbing areas across the country and around the world. So we have a lot of growing pains in climbing. I guess maybe I should try to constrain my answer to development, because when I get into the treating the rock with respect part, I think I can really get on a soapbox. So yeah, it's a shame to see things like the rope grooves on the Wind Below and all the chalk accumulating on the 5-star boulder. I climbed some lines in the 5-star boulder quite a few years ago, and I got to be honest, I'm just not that interested in climbing on it these days. It sort of seems like the time to climb some of those lines has passed for me personally. It's not as fun to climb on rock that's been mistreated like that. And that gives me a really strong drive to take better care of these precious resources so that other people don't have to miss out on getting to climb those lines in a really good shape or in a really good, climbing them at the right time, basically. And the better we preserve it, the more people get to have a really positive experience. Yeah, maybe one other thing I'll say, just because positive experience made me think of this, I think putting up boulders is fundamentally such a selfish thing to do. Maybe I've said this on the pod before. I'm forgetting at this point because I've done 40 of these. I'm starting to forget what things I've said, but the first ascent is the best experience by far. Of course you want it for yourself. And people who have never had a real first ascent experience of something that's kind of challenging for them won't know this. But once you've had a few of them, you realize that it's the purest form of the sport in terms of bouldering. You get all the problem solving, all the exploration, all the curiosity with none of the pressure and none of the cultural trappings that come from repeating hard things that other people have done. I think that's probably why so many prolific first ascensionists are like lone wolves, because of course they want that experience for themselves. But the funny thing is, of course, if we shared nothing and we just left the boulders with a leave no trace attitude, then anybody could have the first ascent experience. And that's actually how some communities are still. There's still not a lot of guidebooks for some areas because the first ascensionists want everybody to have that kind of FA experience. But not a lot of first ascensionists like that. I think we all have a little bit of an ego and we want people to repeat our boulders. And also more altruistically, we want to share the experience with other people, even if it's not as good as the first ascent experience. And yeah, as both a first ascensionist and as a climber, I'm glad that not everybody keeps it to themselves, because I think that would be kind of lame. Even though there is something really cool about just stumbling on a boulder in the woods and climbing it without knowing anything about it, I do think that's something that more people should probably engage with, just because it just kind of smacks you in the head and reminds you of what part of the sport is cool and kind of why you're doing it, at least for me. Thanks for the question, Sam. All right, Fu asks 2 questions. That's not allowed, but one of them is a joke, so I'll do the real question first. Real question: what do people mean by good form? Is good form just biomechanically efficient positioning and movement, or is it more about climbing style? I saw a video where the Japanese youth team had a section in their training called form training and corrections. Well, I think, how do I break this down? I think more efficient could be considered safer from a tissue capacity point of view. So a good example would be if you have a Gaston and you let your shoulder elevate and protract all the way. So you're holding this Gaston, you have a ton of force going through it. but your shoulder's really up high, like you have no neck. So your trap is really lengthened and your lat is really lengthened and your rhomboids, all those muscles that act on the scapula are really long and they're not in a good position to create force. So you wind up with all the load, all the strain through those small muscles of the rotator cuff in order to try to keep your shoulder in a position and not let it explode. Obviously, like your supraspinatus and stuff, those little muscles are much weaker than like your lat and your rhomboid. So from a tissue capacity point of view, the quote good form would be being able to keep your scapula down closer to your back, where all those bigger muscles that act on the scap can produce more force, right? That's like a example where it's pretty clear cut to me that it's going to be safer if you can keep your shoulder in a good position, but that's not always true. So with some things, you can definitely train it and you can develop more capacity. So like full crimp would be a good example. Like there are limits to how safe it is to full crimp, but some people can really train the full crimp and they don't seem to ever have problems with their pulleys, right? And the full crimp is not an efficient position. It's an extremely high leverage position and it creates a lot of force. So in that sense, it's like powerful and it's that kind of efficient, but it's definitely not like relaxed kind of efficient. And these suggestions about form can go too far. Like I've seen like rehab professionals say that if you want to protect your knee, that you should never externally rotate your hip while you're heel hooking. But if you've ever climbed a boulder with a heel hook on it harder than like V3, then you know that you want to externally rotate your hip when you heel hook pretty much all the time. And you're going to wind up having a lot of shear force through your knee. That's part of the sport. So I guess we can sort of make a distinction. It's like, there are these powerful positions and high leverage positions, and then there are very low risk positions. And sometimes those things are going to be similar or like not to the extreme of either. And sometimes they're going to be like polar opposites. So let me see if I can condense it to a suggestion. We probably want to train for the high leverage, high risk positions so that we have capacity in those positions, but we want to maximize the amount of time we spend in high leverage, low risk positions. And that is probably good form. So things like when you grab a Gaston, being able to keep your shoulder packed and in a good position, probably a good thing to train. We could probably call that good form. And then is there a style component? Yeah, but that's a different like semantic definition of good form. That just means like good style, I think. Good question. I hope my word salad was useful there because that one seemed difficult to talk about. Foo's joke question was, is climbing a religion? And my answer is yes. All right. Cian asks, do you ever wear a helmet when bouldering? Are there scenarios you could imagine yourself wearing a helmet if it's not something you've done before? I have not done it before. I have a hard time thinking of specific cases where I would do it. I think it would have to be like a boulder where there was some kind of dab rock that was right behind my head and I couldn't put a pad. It was like close enough that I can't put a pad on it, but it's still far enough that I have space for a helmet, which is a pretty specific scenario. I think a lot of the time I prefer to just have a spotter there who can kind of get their hands between my head and the rock. But again, pretty specific scenario. I feel like there are probably people for whom wearing a helmet makes sense. I learned how to roll from a really young age. I'm quite good at falling. I'm pretty good at protecting my head and not like back flopping off the pads and things like that. There's probably still, like there is for anybody, like a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000 or something risk of falling and slipping off the pads or tripping or something and hitting my head. It's definitely non-zero, but personally doesn't seem worth it to wear a helmet all the time to counteract that risk, even though there's no clear cost to wearing a helmet other than it's a little bit goofy seeming, I think, still culturally. But for sport climbing, I have gone through phases where I wear a helmet all the time, especially after a good friend of mine fell upside down and got a pretty bad concussion. Even though it wasn't me in the accident and I wasn't like belaying or anything like that, it's still just, hearing that story and knowing what happened had a pretty profound impact on me. And I think for a few years after that, every time I tied into a rope, I wore a helmet. And nowadays, I think I've gained a little bit of my lead confidence back. And if I'm climbing a sport climb where I feel like it's very unlikely that I'm going to fall upside down, I won't wear a helmet. But if I'm going into uncertain terrain, especially if it's like vert and it's just a little bit, there's a little bit more of sometimes a question mark in terms of the rope line and weird things happen and you can get your leg in front of the rope. Well, in those cases, I will just wear a helmet. And most of the time with sport climbing, when I bring a helmet to the crag, I feel pretty stupid for not wearing it. So yeah, if my mom was listening, she would probably say I should bring it every time and then I should wear it every time if I have it. So Mom, if you're listening, I hear you. Thank you for looking out for me. But bouldering, not so much. All right, Matthew asks, do you have any specific tips for knowing when to shift from beta discovery to send attempts, either on boulders or routes, though maybe more relevant in sport climbing given the time equity that goes into each attempt? Are there any actionable triggers that should cue a shift in approach, either into send mode or back to beta discovery if the send attempts aren't going well? Okay, this is a good question. And if you haven't listened to my podcast with Carly from last week, or it's the last podcast when this one comes out, I would recommend listening to that because we actually talk about this exact thing for maybe 10 minutes or so. For me, I think I'll split up boulders and routes, although some of this is kind of common between the two of them. I just have a lot more experience red pointing boulders right now. So with boulders, it really depends on the complexity of the boulder and the location of the crux. But probably the biggest piece of advice I can offer is that, and maybe this is just my personal style, maybe it's like where I've landed after bouldering for a long time, but I really never stop discovering beta. My mode just changes from primarily working on moves or lengths to primarily working on red pointing. But the goal of both of those things, if it makes sense, is to gather information about the climb. So my visualization and my execution and the feedback that I get from the wall, from being on the wall, are all like information gathering tools that I have. And I don't really ever stop trying to refine my beta. Yep. I guess basically, let me try to put it into plainer English. Like when I first try a boulder problem, I'm just trying the moves and the very basic positions, and I'm gaining kind of macro information, like big bits of like where my body needs to be and what order I'm going to do the moves in. And do I need to do 3-foot moves here? Can I just do one? And, should I wear these shoes or those shoes? Like kind of the like major stuff. And then at some point in the process, I'm like, okay, I have enough of the major stuff that now I can start like giving it rips basically. But those rips are not like I'm really serious about trying to do it. They're more like I'm going to discover the weaknesses in my macro beta by trying from the beginning and seeing what breaks, sort of. And then I'm getting into like usually more micro beta kind of things. And even when I'm in red point mode on a boulder, I'm still going to try to do links. I usually have a couple key links that I'll do during my warm up. And I basically always, unless it's like a very consequential boulder, I'm basically always going to repeat the exit or the top out at the beginning of every session, sometimes a couple times. So that's like one tactic that I just separate from the actual beta process. But after those key links and after running the top out, I usually am going to try it from the start. And if I discover something that is like a huge gap or a huge hole, I'm like, whoa, I might be doing this totally wrong in terms of the send. Maybe I'll go back to kind of working on a move or working on a specific link. But most of the time I'll just be like, I got something from that, and then I'll kind of integrate it into my beta, and then I'll try from the start again. That's a lot more common for me. And I think part of the reason that I've landed on that after so long is the boulders I'm trying are just much, much harder now than they used to be. And so I can't, try things for hours and hours and hours. So the send attempts feel very high value in terms of like developing the specific power and endurance that I need to climb the boulder. Whereas if I just dick around with moves for hours, I'm getting better at the moves, but I'm not actually building up the physical capacities that I need to send the boulder as much. And also I'm just a little older and my capacity is a little lower than it used to be. And so it feels like in order to be efficient, and yeah, I'm not outcome driven, but I still do want to climb things relatively quickly because there's lots of other cool stuff to do. And so, yeah, with my reduced capacity, it just kind of makes sense for me to try things from the start. And yeah, on a recent project I did this spring, I think I could have done it. I think it took me 5 or 6 sessions, and I could have done it on like session 2 or 3, depending on how you count. Like I had some really good tries in that earlier session, and I wouldn't say like I blew it or anything like that. It was just like the macro and the micro were good enough that I could have done it that day. And then after that, my shape kind of got a little worse and I had to like learn a lot more to get over the threshold. It's always a moving target, the threshold of what you need to send something, because your shape is changing and the conditions are changing and stuff. So all that to say, I take it much more abstractly than having like discrete phases with bouldering. With sport climbing, I think there's a little more of a clear line for me, just because there is still that period, that process of endless refinement. But yeah, the time investment is a lot more complicated, and it's really the commute for me. If I'm going to work on the top 20% of a boulder, like a lot of the time there's just tactics for that. But working on the top 20% of a sport climb is kind of a huge pain in the ass. So if I'm, committing a good chunk of my day to doing that, I'm going to try to do a really, really good job learning the top 20% or whatever before I give it from the bottom. And all the other stuff is still true. Like I still feel like I'm in beta discovery mode even while I'm in red point on a red point try, like on the sharp end. I'm still like trying to learn, not like actively, but I'm open to it, if that makes sense. And yeah, I think it's just it's a little higher emotional commitment like sport climbing is in general, but otherwise my process is like quite similar. There was one other thing I was going to say. Yeah, maybe one way to take this away is like, just because you're going into red point mode or you're giving bottom rips, that shouldn't mean that you're switching to being very outcome driven. You should always be like curiosity and process driven, regardless of where you are along the line of trying to send whatever the climb is. All right, good question. Thanks, Matt. Okay, Brian asks, can you go deep on brushing effects on rock and what to do or not do? I'm an outdoor bouldering Gumby, and I just heard Rocco say not to use hard brushes on sandstone. What can you use? Ooh, can I go deep on brushing effects? I will try my best. Okay, let's zoom out a little bit. General development or brushing rules. Always follow the local ethics, so whatever they do in that area, you want to be at least as ethical as the baseline in that area. So the easiest thing is going to be to read the guidebook or ask somebody who's in that local place and ask them like what they do. And I just try to stay at least as good ethically as that person. So when you're in Waco tanks, that's going to be quite stringent. When you're in some of the more wild areas of the West, maybe it's like a little bit more okay to walk off the trail to take a whiz or whatever. But basically it's like being in a stranger's house. If you follow a stranger into their house, after you've been invited into their house. I'm not talking about breaking into a stranger's house. But yeah, somebody you've never been to their house before, let's say, and they take their shoes off before they go inside. You're going to take your shoes off before you go inside. You're not going to walk into their house with your dirty ass shoes. Same kind of thing applies when you're visiting a new area. So like if they don't destroy vegetation, you better not destroy vegetation. If they don't walk off the trails, better not do that. In places like Waco, I know it's really important not to walk in the tanks because you'll destroy little bacteria and stuff. Little shrimpies. I forget what they're called. Mantis shrimp? Claw shrimp? Somebody help me out there. Whatever they are in Waco tanks, don't step on them. As far as brushing specifically, yeah, the softer the rock, the more careful you want to be. But actually, even if you use an extremely soft boar's hair brush, if everybody did that, like over the years, problems like, chips and Planet of the Apes, and I think nerve extension is really gnarly. They're just going to take a beating. The rock is just super soft, and just pulling on it with your fingers and brushing it with a really soft brush is going to deform it over time. So you just want to be as gentle as you can and understand that you are having an impact. Climbing is not a zero trace activity, so don't be a colossal asshole. That's probably the easiest thing. On harder rock, I think it's more okay to use harder brushes. Personally, I still try to stay away from using wire brushes, except for if I'm cleaning a layer of like lichen or vegetation off of granite. And even here in Leavenworth, I have used wire brushes to clean lichen and then seen that I have left scratch marks on like little pieces of mica and little pieces of granite. Not things that I think that anybody would notice, but I just think it's worth understanding that like you can cause permanent damage to rocks, even though rocks seem really hard. So my general thing is like, if I'm just brushing holds, I'm going to use a boar's hair brush, a pretty soft one. If I am brushing to like clean a boulder that I'm trying to develop, then I will generally use a hard plastic brush, and in extreme cases I'll use a wire brush, but I'm very judicious about where I use that wire brush. Also, the like intensity with which you brush has a pretty profound impact. So sometimes I've seen like joke Instagram reels or like joke YouTube videos where people are like brushing really violently as some kind of like, it's like a, I don't know, haha funny thing, but don't do that. There's nothing about that that's more effective than just using a brush and being really gentle and methodical. It is, as far as I know, okay to use a little bit of alcohol to help the brushing process. So like a little alcohol spray in your bag and a jet fan can be really, really helpful for restoring holds to much cleaner. And basically what that looks like is spraying a little alcohol on. It helps to loosen up some of that grime and oil, and then you can gently brush, and then you can use the fan to dry it. You can actually do a few rounds of this, and that can have a pretty nice kind of healing effect on holds that are quite grimy. All brushing carries some sort of cost. So If you go to places like Squamish where the granite is quite hard and you climb on the really classic boulders in like the Titanic area, everything is very polished and the rock still has a lot of texture. It's not like Joe's Valley where it just turns into a glassy piece of soap. So it's a little more fun to climb on even when it's beat up, but it is definitely beat up and you can tell. So I think being gentle is really, really important. Also, people don't talk about this part, but just using less chalk is fine. Like if you're climbing on a super classic problem, you do not need to like lather yourself in chalk. Like it's probably fine to just use the most minimal amount of chalk you can. And then point number 2 that people don't talk about is to wash your hands like before your session and regularly during your session. That's actually one thing I really like about liquid chalk is it has alcohol in it. And I feel like that makes my hands feel cleaner. And I also like to carry hand sanitizer with me. And I use that fairly regularly as well, especially if you're like moving pads around in the dirt or feeding your dog or whatever, petting a dog, you're just getting oils all over your hands, putting sunscreen on. If you do anything like that, taking the time to rinse your hands and then put some alcohol-based hand sanitizer on would be pretty helpful in terms of not getting all that shit in the holds. So yeah, I don't know if that counts as deep, but that's everything I have to say on the subject. Okay, Anthony asks, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for sharing your reflection on Tiberius's passing. Your post inspired me to take my family dogs out to the Crag more often despite the overhead. That leads me to my question. Do you have advice on proper etiquette when taking dogs to the Crag and tips on training dogs to behave at the Crag? One of my dogs struggles to stay off pads while people are climbing, and the other can't keep away from falling candy bar wrappers or half-eaten sandwiches. One thing I especially struggle with is disciplining the dogs in front of strangers. It just feels so awkward. But even if they are relatively well behaved, sometimes I can tell people are uncomfortable with the dogs, and I'm not sure if it would be best if I just leave. Any anecdotes or advice about dogs in crags would be super helpful. Thanks, man. For anybody who just listens to the podcast and doesn't follow me anywhere else, my dog passed away a couple months ago. He was a really sweet boy. He was 16, almost 16, and at the end, just about the best crag dog that you could ask for, thanks to many, many years of spending lots of time at the boulders. But as far as this question goes, we can start at the beginning when I first got him. And that weekend, I came to Leavenworth and let him out of the van and walked up to the boulders, and he lifted his leg and peed on a stranger's backpack and crash pad about 10 minutes into the weekend. So he did not start out as a good crag dog. Yeah, there's a few angles to attack this from. I mean, I think the first one and most important one is if it's important to you to have your dogs at the crag, then it's going to be a long uphill journey to get them conditioned to it. And a dog is only as good as its owner or caretaker, and it's 100% on you. So if the dogs are struggling with that environment, then that is you struggling with that environment. And I think if I had 2 dogs, probably the first thing I would do would be just bring one of them at a time, and I'd probably switch off which one, because it's 2 versus 1, and if you're there with somebody else who can maybe help you with the dogs, maybe it's a little bit more even. But dogs, much like people, are exponential in nature. So it's just a lot harder to contain 2 than it is to contain 1. And, as you know, if you act a certain way towards one, the other one is probably going to react in a certain way, and they bounce off each other and stuff. So I think just one at a time would probably be a lot easier in terms of getting them adapted to the environment. And I'm guessing that dog trainers would agree with that, but I actually don't know for sure. On the note of dog trainers, though, and probably my second tip would be, as far as everything I know, disciplining the dogs really doesn't work in terms of like negative reinforcement. So what you want to do is the same thing that you want to do with kids and babies, which is if they start to have negative emotions or start to do negative behaviors that you don't want them to, the best thing you can do is distract them. So if your dog is struggling to stay off pads while people are climbing, it's one thing to just say like shoo and like try to push it away. And that can be effective once they know what you want. But it's actually much easier to just move away from the pads and call the dog or have something that the dog is going to be motivated by to get them to move off of the pads. And that is an example of something that is in my third point, which is you want to practice a lot of this stuff more at home. So making it clear that the pads are not something that they can go on is something you can practice in your backyard or at a park. And I would suggest having an area that's okay for them to be. So if you've taught your dogs the place command, like if they have a crate, that can be really helpful. Put your pad in your backyard, put your crate in your backyard, and just have them go in their crate, and then you hang out on the pad. And when they try to come up on the pad and hang out with you, have them go back to their crate and then give them a treat, and just do that over and over and over until they're like, oh, when Anthony's on the pad, I go in my crate. And then hopefully you have, something you can attach to the crate, like a little piece of carpet you put in there or your sweatshirt or something. And then you take the crate, move the crate further away and, put the sweatshirt a little bit closer, and then have them, do plays going to the sweatshirt, reward them for that, et cetera, et cetera. And if this is all sounding like a lot of work, then you understand what it takes to have a good crag dog. It's not easy. And when I first got Ty, it was pretty much my other full-time job training him. And you have to be pretty creative, but I'm not a great dog trainer. I read a couple books when I first got him. But once you get the hang of it, situations like the one I just described, if your dog is food motivated, it's pretty easy to get them to do what you want. You just have to figure out how to create an environment where you're going to challenge them in that exact way, and then you can reinforce them. Maybe this is why I became a coach. I'm not really sure. Yeah. I want to say that there's a training beta episode from a while ago with a dog trainer about dogs at Crags. I never listened to it, but you could check that out. Trying to think if I have any other points. Oh, if your dogs struggle with recall, something that was really, really helpful for us at the time that I got Ty was to go on hikes with my partner. You could do it with a friend. Take him off leash, so you'll want to be at a trail where there's not a lot of other people, and then just both have treats and hike about 100, 200 feet apart from each other, and just let the dog pinball back and forth between you. And every time he comes to one of you, you give him a treat. And obviously you can call him, but the important thing is to just establish that every time you come to me, you get rewarded, to the point that they just will check in with you all the time. And it's going to be really breed dependent and dog dependent and stuff. And it's a big challenge. So I wish you the best. I know that it's really tough for a lot of people, but also dogs are awesome. And Ty was probably not every single person's favorite character at the Crag. I'm sure that some people did not like having him there, and I'm sure he barked and annoyed people at times, and he peed on that guy's pad. I don't think he ever stole any food, but maybe he did, and I don't even know about it, There's always a cost to having them there, but I'd like to think that the benefits outweigh it, and I sure am glad that I got to have so much time at the Crag with him. So I know that's selfish, but it meant a lot to me. So I hope that you can find some equanimity in your own situation with your dogs, and hey, I hope I get to meet them out at the Crag someday. Thanks for the question. Appreciate any opportunity to talk about Ty. Okay. Thanks, everybody. That's all the questions. I can hear Charlotte screeching in the background, and I must go attend to her. So thank you once again for supporting the show. And if you have questions and you'd like to ask them for the May episode, go ahead and sign up for Patreon, patreon.com/innerfireclimbing. Appreciate everybody's support, and I will see you next month. Thanks for listening.